Okay, I see that we've had a few more people join, so I think we will begin. Just to start, just to note, the session is being recorded. So welcome everyone to this presentation by SeaChoice on our Seafood Progress platform. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Dana Cleveley. I started working for SeaChoice in January of this year as their supply chain analyst. Most of you may recall that my position used to be held by Leanne Arness, who is now the national manager for SeaChoice. So my background touches on various points in the seafood industry. I grew up in a commercial fishing family in Vancouver, Canada, where I gained perspective on seafood harvesting practices. I later took on the role of sales and logistics manager for a seafood retail and wholesale company called Gold River Seafood. And I decided to back this experience with education by obtaining a Bachelor of Commerce from Royal Roads University. So the presentation should take about 35 minutes or so, leaving us time at the end for questions and discussion. So we'll start with an overview of SeaChoice, then we'll move to a discussion of the development of Seafood Progress. And then next we'll dive into Seafood Progress score changes, first overall, and then looking at step by step. And then we'll finish off the presentation with a quick overview of what our next steps are for Seafood Progress. So founded in 2006, SeaChoice is a partnership among the David Suzuki Foundation, Ecology Action Center, and Living Ocean Society. And SeaChoice's current vision is for Canada to be positioned as a global leader in responsible and sustainable seafood production and procurement. One of our roles in the ecosystem of organizations is to be a watchdog of the seafood industry. So I know there's a lot of new participants in the Conservation Alliance. So before we take a look at the national average scoring changes since 2018, I'll start by giving a little bit of background on SeaChoice. So from 2006 to 2016, SeaChoice focused on providing information on seafood sustainability to the entire seafood supply chain, from harvesters to consumers. We also provided seafood sustainability rankings for Canadian consumers to help them make the best seafood choices. So based on Monterey Bay Aquarium's Seafood Watch model, we used a red, avoid, yellow, some concerns, and green best choice system on package. SeaChoice also at that time partnered with various Canadian retailers. And most of our partners met their sourcing goals of removing or limiting their red ranked products and replacing them with more sustainable alternatives by 2016. So to use a fisheries analogy, we had fully exploited our capacity to make change using that strategy. So at that point, we pivoted to a different strategy that took more of a watchdog approach, which involved ending our retail partnerships and developing a tool called Seafood Progress that would leverage public pressure on all of Canada's major retailers to continue pushing for improvements to their sustainability policies. So the theory of change is that this will have impacts down the supply chain as retailers place different demands on their suppliers and work with them to improve their practices. So in addition to putting more resources into traceability and labeling, in 2017, SeaChoice began developing a tool called Seafood Progress to ensure retailers continue to improve their supply chains. And the first round of Seafood Progress profiles was made live in 2018. And at that time, we used 21 key performance indicators to assess these retailers' seafood policies and procurement practices. And these KPIs were derived from the Conservation Alliance for Seafood Solutions Common Vision. So we selected retailers based on their prevalence in the Canadian marketplace. For example, number of stores and whether they had stores in at least 2 provinces or territories. Retailers were not given the option to opt out, but they were invited to lean in and engage with us to share information that wasn't publicly available in order to better inform their profiles. And if retailers decided not to engage, their profile was based on solely on publicly available information. And I just want to note that at this time, only 2 retailers profiled on Seafood Progress were regularly reporting on the percent of seafood that they sold that met their commitment. So as per the common vision, the 6 steps of Seafood Progress answer the following questions. So number 1, commitment. Does the retailer have a comprehensive commitment on sustainable seafood? Number 2, data collection. Does the retailer collect data to support its commitment? Number 3, responsible sourcing. Does the retailer make responsible sourcing decisions? Number 4, transparency. Is the retailer transparent about its commitment? Number 5, education. Does the retailer educate its staff, customers, and suppliers about the importance of its commitment? And finally, number 6, supports improvements. Does the retailer support improvements in fisheries and aquaculture? So in the second Seafood Progress update in 2019, we incorporated the standalone KPI on a commitment to traceability into the KPIs for the environmental sustainability and social responsibility commitments. And this reflected the fact that traceability is a key component of both. Also in year 2, Walmart Canada and Metro both decided to start publishing information on where the seafood that they procure comes from and how it was produced. So Walmart Canada discloses this information through the Ocean Disclosure Project, and Metro does so through its own platform called Freshness You Can Trace. So in year 3, 2020, Seafood Progress profiled 8 major Canadian retailers and actively engaged with all except for Costco Canada. Also in year 3, we started bringing more attention to the scope of retailers' seafood commitments. So as you know, retailers have different parameters for the seafood products their policy or commitments apply to. And these parameters apply to the type of brand, whether it's a retailer's own grocery store brand, otherwise known as private label. So for example, Loblaw's President's Choice, Sobeys Compliments, or Costco's Kirkland Signature, or an external seafood company's brand, otherwise known as national brand. So for example, Highliner, Birdseye, or Cloverleaf. And finally, other products, fresh or frozen, that are not branded. So for example, fillets or whole fish that are ordered from seafood counters or pre-portioned on styrofoam trays. So in many retail companies, fresh and frozen seafood products are managed by the meat and seafood department, while seafood products that are stored at room temperature, for example, canned tuna, are handled by the grocery department. And interestingly, the grocery department may or may not adhere to the retailer's seafood sourcing commitment or policy. And in some companies, unbranded fresh or frozen products weren't covered either. So to direct more attention to the scope of retailers' commitments, SeaChoice introduced these infographics on the right of the screen in 2020. to demonstrate the seafood categories and brand categories that retailers' commitments apply to. And as of 2020, only 2 of the 8 retailers included all shelf-stable products under their commitments, as you can see. So moving on then to year 4, which is this current year, 2021. Of note in year 4, we saw 3 retailers, Bilo, Save On Foods, and Metro, send letters to the Canadian government in support of a robust boat-to-plate traceability commitment. And additionally, 2 KPIs were introduced to Seafood Progress to bring more attention to the scope of retailers' commitments. One focused on products covered and one focused on banners covered. And finally, in 2021, 4 retailers were regularly reporting, and 3 had reported once on the amount of seafood sold that meets their commitment. And, you know, this is a noteworthy improvement from 2018, when only 2 retailers were regularly reporting and 2 had reported once. So just to dig into those 2 KPIs a bit, the first scores how many banners the retailer's commitment applies to. So in case, for those who don't know, banners are store brands that large retailers own and operate, and which are tailored to meet different customer needs. So retailers' commitments don't necessarily apply to all of their banners. For example, while Loblaw's seafood commitment applies to all types of seafood in most of its stores, it does not apply to products sold in T&T Supermarket, for example. So we introduced KPI 1.3 because we wanted to bring more attention to the fact that retailers' commitments don't necessarily apply to all of their stores. So the second KPI introduced reflects whether the categories most in need of improvement, which are national seafood brand products and shelf-stable products, are included in retailers' commitments. So while the number of retailers to include all seafood under their commitments is increasing, national brand products continue to be the category that is most commonly excluded. And also of note, in 2021, after 4 years of no engagement with Seafood Progress, we decided not to include Costco's scores in the national average calculations, just to avoid creating an artificially low bar for other retailers. So we plan to continue trying to engage with Costco Canada in hopes of filling in some of the gaps in its profile that are leading to such low scores. Because its publicly available information isn't detailed enough to inform scoring. Okay, so at this point, now that you're up to speed on Seafood Progress history, we'll move on and take a look at how retailers' scores have changed across the board since 2018. So since Seafood Progress began in 2018, we have seen a 33% increase across all 6 steps in the framework. So we'll take a look at the national average scores for each step in 2018 compared to 2021. And identify the percentage of increase since 2018. And just before I move through these, note that there have been some changes to the framework and scoring over the years that will have had some effect on the scores. So if anyone is interested in hearing the details of this, please do reach out to me. So for step 1 commitment, the national average in 2018 was 62% and is now up to 77% in 2021, which equates to a 19% increase. For step 2, data collection increased from 63% to 91% in 2021, which amounted to a 31% increase. Looking at step 3, responsible sourcing, we saw 63% in 2018 compared to 85% in 2021, or a 25% increase. For step 4, transparency, 37% in 2018 and 61% in 2021. So for that one, we saw a 40% increase. Moving on to education, 50% in 2018, up to 79% in 2021, so a 36% increase. And finally, step 6, 20% in 2018, up to 49% in 2021. So a 59% increase. However, as you can see, it is obviously the lowest scoring step. So next, we're going to take a closer look at each step. So we'll start with step 1, commitment, and we're going to use a SWOT analysis, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, to evaluate the step's position and to inform our strategy for encouraging further improvements. So in terms of strengths, this year we added 2 KPIs to the Seafood Progress Framework, as mentioned. And the first was KPI 1.3, which considers how many store banners a retailer covers under their seafood commitments. And we were pleased to learn that on average, 95% of store banners are included by retailers. However, the addition of KPI 1.4, which scores retailers on how many product segments are covered by their commitment, pulled the national average for step 1 down this year. So this KPI takes an all or nothing approach, and it awards retailers who include all national brand and shelf-stable products under their commitment with 100, and those that don't with 0. So the results were 50-50, with a few retailers sharing their intentions to accomplish this expansion over the next year. In terms of opportunities, RISE 2.0 is making it easier for retailers to make progress in this area, as it provides targeted guidance for retailers to develop and maintain traceable commitments to sourcing socially responsible seafood. And finally, many retailers are unsure about how to introduce traceability into their social responsibility commitments, and concrete examples and tools for how to do this are still in development. So this can be considered a threat. So moving on to step 2, data collection. So this step has seen the highest national average of all the steps at 91%. And there has also been an equal score increase across all 4 of the key data elements, which are scientific name, geographic origin, whether the product is farmed or wild, and the gear type or farming method used. And this is a bit nitpicky, but in terms of a weakness, the collection of gear type or farming method data is marginally lower than the collection of the other 3 key data elements. And of course, in terms of opportunities, once again, consumer desire for transparency can be capitalized on by retailers. So to meet the demand for more informative seafood labels, the 2 retailers that are still not collecting data on geographic origin, production method, scientific name, and farmed wild on all products will need to do so. And then finally, though not a threat to the progression of data collection, we have learned that some retailers mistake data collection for traceability. So one of our focuses over the next cycle is to help bring more clarity to seafood traceability for retailers. So moving on to step 3, responsible sourcing. Since their first time reporting, 100% of Metro's, Loblaws, and Bilo's seafood sold in store was in line with their commitments. And the other 4 retailers profiled on Seafood Progress, excluding Costco, who hasn't reported to date, have not managed to bring 100% of their seafood under their commitment. But the percentage that does meet their commitment has increased on average by 19% since they first reported. Also, supplier codes of conduct to support retailers' environmental sustainability commitments for seafood have become more comprehensive across the board since 2018. Looking at weaknesses, retailers have not made any improvements to their supplier codes of conduct that uphold their commitments to social responsibility since 2018. And many of those are considered to be far below best practice. Also, not all retailers' codes of conduct that support their commitments to sustainability and social responsibility are being verified after the initial agreement. So of course, there's the opportunity to leverage the fact that human rights in the seafood world is gaining attention and becoming more important to consumers. And then finally, in terms of a threat, as more retailers expand the scope of their commitment to include shelf-stable and national brand products, the percentage of seafood that is in line with their commitment may decrease, and for some significantly. So we try to frame this as a necessary growing pain for retailers to achieve best practice, and we do our best to promote their efforts through our media channels and communications. So on to step 4, transparency. So we are seeing more retailers regularly report on the percentage of their seafood that is in line with their commitments. In fact, there has been a 51% increase in reporting by retailers since Seafood Progress began. And also, retailers are including eco-labels and more of the key data elements on their private label products. Looking at weaknesses, one KPI under step 4 considers if retailers share a list of the products that they procure with region and gear type with the public. And currently only 2 retailers are publishing this information. And as a result, this KPI, the KPI that is scoring this is the lowest in the framework. And moving on to opportunities, various research, including a consumer survey that SeaChoice conducted recently, shows that consumers are frustrated by the lack of origin information and inadequate information in general on labels. So this consumer interest can be leveraged to drive further improvements to labeling information. And then finally, in terms of threats, the Canadian government requires product of labeling for imported products, but not geographical origin, leading to consumer confusion that product of means the product was fished or farmed in that country, when that may not be the case. Additionally, most retailers, as mentioned, aside from Walmart and Metro, have not shared a list of the products they sell with region and gear type with the public, giving us the argument that retailers consider this information to be proprietary. Oops. Okay, second to last, step 5, education. So the national averages for the KPIs related to staff education and supplier education are both quite high at 89%. However, though there has been overall progress on consumer education, most retailers that do provide information in store have not included all the information that consumers need to make informed decisions. There is the opportunity, of course, for revenue gains directly associated with in-store sustainability campaigns. For instance, in 2020, select Walmart US stores attributed a 25% increase in fresh seafood sales to a campaign that involved sourcing more sustainable seafood products. And finally, in terms of threats, though most customers still do shop in store, the trend towards online ordering is deterring retailers from incurring the expense and going to the effort of introducing in-store signage on its seafood commitments. Okay, and finally, step 6 supports improvements. Oh, sorry. So this step, just to note, is broken down into 4 KPIs. So 1 for supporting improvements to Atlantic salmon production, 1 for skipjack tuna, 1 for imported shrimp and prawns, and 1 for general improvements. So in terms of strengths, there has been a continual increase in retailers taking action to support general industry improvements to skipjack tuna, and improvements to imported shrimp and prawns through activities such as outreach and working with suppliers and producers. In terms of weaknesses, despite showing the highest improvement rate of all the steps, step 6 is the step with the lowest national average at 49%. And also, we have seen minimal progress on retailer activities to support farmed Atlantic salmon. So we do see the opportunity for more outreach from retailers. This past year, there has been more activity in that regard. For example, 3 major Canadian retailers sent letters to the government in support of the boat to plate traceability commitment, as mentioned. Additionally, half of the retailers that we profile now include canned products under their seafood commitments, which is up from a quarter in 2020. And covering this category puts retailers in a better position to stop selling skipjack tuna products that don't meet the highest bars for sustainability. And then taking a look at threats, unfortunately, the competitive nature of the food industry keeps Canadian retailers from collaborating with other companies pre-competitively to improve fishing and aquaculture practices. And also, retailers continue to advertise products that don't meet the highest bars for sustainability, which of course undermines their commitments and industry improvements. So with these analyses in mind, we considered where our efforts would be best spent with retailers over our next cycle. So the area where we have consistently seen the least amount of progress being made and is therefore of most concern to us is social responsibility. We want to see retailers graduate from the status quo in this area and the don't ask, don't tell kind of approach to taking a leadership role in keeping human rights abuses out of their supply chains. Another area where we want to push for progress is commitment scope. Hence introducing a KPI in 2001 to isolate the most problematic product categories, shelf stable and national brand. While it's challenging to affect the ambition of retailers' commitments, we are able to encourage them to cover all of the products that they sell under them. And while they work towards that, we want them to be clear and transparent with their customers about what is and what isn't covered. And then finally, we want to see retailers use the power of their positions to drive more industry improvements throughout their supply chains, particularly in the production of farmed Atlantic salmon and skipjack tuna. No. So before I conclude the presentation, one other noteworthy next step for Seafood Progress is that over the next year, we will be beginning to profile national brand suppliers for the first time. So at this time, we're in the process of doing a scoping exercise to select those companies that we will approach. And then over the next year, we will be going through the similar process as we do with retailers to engage with and release the first round of profiles for those suppliers. So that concludes the presentation. We have lots of time for questions, so I'm going to open it up and see if anyone has anything to ask.
Hi everyone, Leanne here. Just wanted to say you can, as you prefer, type your question in the chat box or unmute yourself and ask it out loud.
Yeah, I have a question. This is Celeste LaRue. I was wondering, I'm unfamiliar with your organization, so this is new to me, but it wasn't clear to me how you get your information. Are you just looking at what's available online? Are you interviewing these companies? Are you trying to interview these companies and not succeeding in doing that? I'm just curious to know how you got the information you presented here.
Yeah, thanks, Celeste. So we engage, and by engage, I mean meeting typically 2 to 3 times per year with representatives from 7 of the 8 retailers that we profile on Seafood Progress. So yes, the information that we provide is actually validated by typically their sustainability directors that we meet with and managers of the meat and seafood department, for example. And they often get, validation on if there are things that they don't have answers for us on, they will get that from members of their team that do have those answers and provide it to us. So you'll notice if you go to our site and you click on one of the retailers and get into the steps, under each step, there is a rationale paragraph that is essentially a quote from the person that we interviewed and validated the information from or verified the information from. And if we can't, like using Costco Canada as an example, if we can't engage with them directly, then we are basing it solely on publicly available information, which can be very limited.
Thank you. I have one other question and then I'll stop. So I'm curious what your organization plans on doing about the CFIA discussion draft on boat-to-plate traceability. I understand that there are very few vocal stakeholders in Canada supporting this activity, and I'm wondering if you guys are planning to be a public voice in this or if you're rather trying to push your views through retailers.
We are taking both approaches. So we are, I'll let Leanne speak to this a bit more. I can tell you that, we were very pleased to get 3 retailers to sign on to the letter in support of our recommendations. But we have made our own recommendations to CFIA. In terms of them being publicly available, I'll let Leanne speak to that because I'm not 100% certain if we will be going that route.
Thanks, Dana, and thanks for the great question, Celeste. So yeah, SeaChoice will be kind of working on the boat-to-plate traceability mandate 2 different ways, or maybe even 3 different ways. One will be kind of providing our recommendations directly to the government agencies responsible for implementing the boat-to-plate traceability mandate. One of them will be kind of engaging with our public audience and encouraging them to, sign petitions and show their support in general for boat-to-plate traceability being widely applicable in Canada. using arguments around better seafood labeling. So you're not going to have better seafood labeling without traceability to underpin it. And then the third way we're working is kind of working with the retailers that we've got good relationships with and telling them a little bit more about the boat to plate traceability mandate, kind of the pros and cons, and encouraging them, if they are interested, in contacting the CFIA and showing their support for a wide-ranging and comprehensive boat to plate traceability requirement for all seafood products sold in Canada, as opposed to, because we're kind of worried that the government might just implement these requirements for products destined for export. Canada exports a lot of high value seafood, but we want to make sure that that program will benefit Canadian consumers as well as Canadian producers and harvesters.
Thank you.
Thanks, Celeste. Are there any other questions out there?
Hello. Thank you so much for the presentation today. I think it's really fascinating to hear about your group looking at doing these scorecards for suppliers. And it sounds like it's still very much early days. Do you have any idea of how many scorecards, aka how many suppliers you're going to have to do assessments for? I'm curious, in the Canadian market, do retailers have typically 3 or 4 suppliers, or is it more than that, or just one?
Yeah, thank you for that. It is definitely very early days for this. At this point, we're not sure how many we will be profiling. Our process is going to be scoping, who's out there, who the suppliers are, and our focus will be, prevalence in the Canadian marketplace. So a challenge with suppliers is that many of them are also exporting. And for SeaChoice, our focus is on seafood in the Canadian market. So we will be looking to profile the suppliers that are, show up the most in Canadian retailers. So at this point, I'm sorry, I can't answer your question as to how many we will profile, but if you stay tuned, you will see within the next year as we introduce that onto our website and bring up their profiles.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I would just add to what Dana said that we'll probably take a similar approach as with the retailer profiles for Seafood Progress. So we didn't profile every retailer in Canada. We focused on the biggest ones, and we'll probably do the same thing with suppliers, because at a certain point there's kind of diminishing returns, and we're a small team. So we'll probably focus on the biggest ones that we are supplying products to the Canadian market.
Very cool. It'll be really interesting to see what those indicators are. And I think they'll be very, just helpful for I work for a supplier. So for me, that's of huge interest just to see what those indicators end up being. Fascinating. Thank you.
So I'm just looking at, I see Nathan put a question in the chat. Might have already been said, will this presentation be shared with attendees? I believe it can be, Leanne.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been recording this session for people who weren't able to join at the time to kind of view this live and participate. But we'll send the link of the recording to everybody that registered their interest in seeing it. And if it would be helpful, we can send the slide deck as well.
Yeah, no
I have a
problem.
question. Hi, I'm Dan Barron from Fishwise. I'm on the data team. And yes, just to follow up on what Celeste was asking about your process for collecting data, sounds like you're meeting with these leads at the retailers. I'm wondering what other tools you're using to actually assess like the green, yellow, red level sustainability of all their products and sources. Are they using their own tools? Do they actually give you spreadsheets, or is it just simply like a high level? Yeah, just kind of curious a little bit more about that process to get a little more granular on ensuring that all their products are green or yellow rated, if you're still doing that.
Thanks, Dan. So we are no longer doing the seafood ranking. I believe that ended in 2016, perhaps earlier. Leanne can verify that. But the way that Seafood Progress works is, each retailer has a different framework for their commitment. So we don't look at the what their framework is, but we look at which types of seafood that they sell are in line with their commitment. And in terms of verifying that is true, beyond getting their word for it, unfortunately, as a small team, we are not able to, conduct audits or verify that information on a regular basis. We do the occasional label audit in store. And if we find anything that is amiss, we let the retailer know and bring it to their attention. Otherwise, it is very much a, getting their word for it and quoting them on it.
I would just add to what Dana said there. We try and introduce some accountability by giving the name and position of the person who gave us that information. So on Seafood Progress, anytime you see information that wasn't publicly available, there will be a reference for when we received that information and who gave it to us. So it's not a perfect system, I admit, but we also just don't have the capacity to assess the full seafood kind of SKU collection for all the major retailers in Canada. So we are pretty sure they're giving us correct information. It would be, a big risk to lie about it in a public forum. But that's how we do it.
And do you happen to know of any particular tools that any of these retailers are using? You mentioned Walmart uses ODP for showing commitments, but any other tools you're familiar with of how they're actually collecting sourcing data that you've come across? Just any trends or anything, or is it pretty much just you're focusing on them reporting that they are meeting their policy and that's the core focus?
We've heard the occasional, name drop of, system that they use for traceability in their practices overall. But in terms of specifically collecting and tracing data, as mentioned in the presentation, traceability is kind of a pain point with retailers where they're kind of uncertain as to how to go about it. So we've identified that there seems to be perhaps the process is different with their other commodities and it doesn't translate over to seafood, but we're definitely noticing that seafood traceability is an area where retailers are uncertain of how to go about it and what it needs to look like. And those that are doing it, I can't say off the top of my head, Leanne might say otherwise, but I don't think any of them have specifically shared with us what platform they use or how they go about conducting their traceability work. Again, that might be something that is considered proprietary. And with them knowing that we're working with other retailers, it could be a concern that they don't want to share what system they are using.
Dan, was your question about what traceability platform they're using, or what platform are they using to track their procurement against their commitment?
Yeah, I know that ODP is more the latter, but yeah, curious on all sides how they track sourcing, which could be traceability, how they rate their products to determine that they're meeting the commitments, like equivalent to the green, yellow, red, those types of things. Just kind of curious what tools are at their disposal and what they're using. But
yeah, it kind of depends on if they have an NGO partner, and many of them do. They'll often use a tool that's developed by their NGO partner. So for example, the retailers that are partnered with Oceanwise, Oceanwise kind of does an audit for them annually or possibly more regularly than that if requested, where they look at the provenance information for all of their SKUs and tell them what is ocean-wise and what's not. And that is how at least some of the ocean-wise partners determine how much of their seafood is meeting their commitment. Other retailers that don't have an ocean-wise based commitment, so to speak, would look at often information from their suppliers about whether products are certified by MSC or ASC or BAP, etc. And those often also have Seafood Watch rankings associated with them. So because of the different structure of the retailers' commitments, they all kind of do it slightly differently.
Great. Well, thanks so much for that. And great presentation. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Any other questions out there? Okay, well, I think that's a great place to wrap up the presentation then. If any questions do arise after we conclude, please feel free to reach out to Leanne or I. Yeah, and as Leanne mentioned, we will send off a recording of the presentation to all of the attendees and those that could not attend. I think that wraps it up. Thank you very much for everyone who did show up today and for all of the great questions.